In the fall of 2017, a small team of American Special Operations soldiers pushed through the Syrian desert east of the Euphrates River. They were advising Kurdish fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces moving against the last pockets of ISIS territory. Less than 30 miles away, Russian Spetsnaz operators were on the ground doing something similar. Different side, different allies, same desert. The standing order for every American operator in that theater was clear. Do not engage Russian forces directly, under any circumstances, not even if they shot first. That order was never published in a press release. It was never announced in a Pentagon briefing. But it was real, and every special operations soldier who rotated through Syria knew it. The reason behind that order reveals something about how close the United States and Russia came to direct military conflicts during the Syrian civil war, and why both sides were working extremely hard to make sure nobody found out just how close it actually got. To understand why that rule existed, you need to understand what Syria looked like in late 2015. By September of 2015, Bashar al-Assad's government was losing. The Syrian Arab army had been ground down by 4 years of civil war. ISIS controlled a territory roughly the size of the United Kingdom across eastern Syria and northern Iraq. Various rebel factions held large sections of western and northern Syria. Assad was running out of room. That's when Vladimir Putin made a decision that changed the entire trajectory of the war. On September 30th, 2015, Russia launched its first air strikes in Syria, operating out of Hmeimim Air Base in Latakia province on Syria's Mediterranean coast. Russian Su-24 and Su-34 jets began striking targets across the country within 24 hours of the announcement. The stated mission was fighting terrorism. The actual mission was keeping Assad alive. But here's the problem. American Special Operations Forces were already in Syria. They had been there quietly for over a year, embedded with Kurdish Peshmerga fighters and later with the Syrian Democratic Forces in the country's northeast. Small teams of Delta Force operators, Army Special Forces soldiers, and CIA paramilitary officers were operating throughout the country with no formal announcement and no public acknowledgement from Washington. Now, suddenly Russian attack aircraft were flying combat missions in the same airspace. Russian ground forces were beginning to deploy alongside Syrian army units, and Spetsnaz, Russia's special operations arm, was not far behind. Two nuclear-armed superpowers were now operating inside the borders of a collapsing country with no unified command structure, no shared communications, and no formal agreement about who was allowed to be where. The potential for a catastrophic accident or a catastrophic decision was obvious to everyone involved. The Pentagon and the Russian Ministry of Defense established what became known as a deconfliction channel, a dedicated communications line between U.S. and Central Command in Tampa, Florida, and Russian military counterparts in Moscow. The channel operated daily. Officers from both sides would go over planned operations, geographic boundaries, and flight corridors to ensure that American and Russian forces did not end up shooting at the same position from opposite directions. In theory, this system worked. In practice, it was one of the most tense and fragile arrangements in modern military history. There were incidents. Russian aircraft crossed into zones that U.S. planners had identified as American operating areas. American-backed Kurdish fighters in the city of Manbij came into contact with Russian military police who had moved into the same district. On multiple occasions, convoys from both sides ended up on the same road, heading in opposite directions. Officers would get on the phone, figure out what had happened, and both sides would back off. The standing rule for American operators was built around one core reality. A direct firefight between U.S. Special Forces and Russian Spetsnaz would not just be a skirmish. It would be an international incident with no clean off-ramp. The domestic political pressure in both countries would be enormous. The escalation ladder, going from proxy conflict to direct confrontation to something far worse, would suddenly become very short. So the rule was simple: avoid contact. If contact was unavoidable, break contact. Do not initiate. Do not escalate. But then came February 7th, 2018. On the eastern bank of the Euphrates River, near a small town called Qashm in Deir ez-Zor province, a mixed force of Syrian government fighters and Russian mercenaries crossed the river toward an outpost held by American Special Operations soldiers and their Syrian Democratic Forces partners. The attacking force was roughly 500 men, backed by artillery, tanks, and armored vehicles. The American position had fewer than 50 U.S. personnel. What made this incident different from every other close call in Syria was who the attackers were. They were not ISIS fighters. They were not Syrian rebels. Significant elements of the attacking force were members of the Wagner Group, a private Russian military company that had been operating in Syria since 2016. Wagner fighters were not officially Russian military, which gave the Kremlin plausible deniability. Their leadership was former Spetsnaz. Their training was Russian military doctrine, and many of their personnel were veterans of Russian Special Operations units. The American commander on the ground called up the deconfliction hotline and warned the Russian side that a force was approaching the U.S. position. The Russian officer on the line, according to multiple accounts, denied any knowledge of the advancing column and denied that Russian forces were involved. The column kept advancing. American forces requested AIR support. Over the next 4 hours, United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles, AC-130 gunships, and B-52 bombers flying from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar struck the advancing column repeatedly. Apache attack helicopters from the U.S. Army joined the engagement. Marine Corps artillery fired from positions across the river. When it was over, approximately 100 members of the Wagner Group were dead. Some estimates put the number higher. Dozens more were wounded. The attacking force collapsed and retreated back across the Euphrates. No American personnel were killed. The Kremlin's official response was that no Russian citizens had died in Deir ez-Zor that night. Wagner Group officially did not exist as far as Moscow was concerned. Russian state media ran no coverage. The Russian families of the men who died were, in many cases, warned not to speak publicly about where their sons and husbands had gone. The official silence was deliberate, because if Russia acknowledged that its fighters had attacked a U.S. position and been destroyed, it would have to respond. And responding meant escalation. Escalation in a theater where both sides had nuclear weapons in the background of every decision was something neither government actually wanted. The ban on direct engagement with Spetsnaz was not weakness. It was an acknowledgement of something that military planners understand and that most news coverage never explains. When two nuclear powers share a battlefield, every tactical decision carries strategic weight. The American operators who had to stand down were not doing so because their commanders did not trust their training. They were doing so because a firefight between Delta Force and Spetsnaz in some eastern Syrian village had the potential to end with a phone call between two presidents, not two colonels. Deconfliction, for all its tension and all its near misses, worked for the specific reason it was designed to work. It gave both sides a way to back away from incidents without anyone losing face publicly. The Wagner attack in February 2018 tested that system harder than anything else that happened in Syria. Even then, both governments found a way to absorb what happened without letting it become something larger. What Spetsnaz was actually doing in Syria during this period went well beyond guarding Russian bases. Russian Special Operations soldiers from the 346th Spetsnaz Brigade and other units were documented operating in Palmyra after the city was recaptured from ISIS in March 2016. Russian military advisors embedded with Syrian Arab army units helped plan and execute the battle for Aleppo in late 2016. Russian forward air controllers were operating close to the front lines in multiple provinces, directing Russian aircraft onto targets in coordination with Syrian ground forces. In several cases, these Spetsnaz elements were operating in areas where American-backed Kurdish forces were also present. The deconfliction hotline was used on at least a dozen documented occasions to prevent those overlapping operations from turning into direct confrontations. The Syria deconfliction model has since become something of a case study in how great powers can manage proxy conflicts without letting them spiral. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't comfortable. There were moments when a single wrong decision by a single operator could have changed everything, but it held. The ban on engaging Spetsnaz directly was never about doubting what American Special Operations soldiers could do in a fight. Anyone who knows the history of Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, or Army Special Forces understands that question has a pretty clear answer. The ban existed because the people making decisions at the highest levels of the American military understood that winning a firefight and winning a war are two completely different things. And in Syria, in a desert valley along the Euphrates River, with two nuclear arsenals sitting somewhere in the background, the math was simple. Don't start something that can't be finished with soldiers. Subscribe. New military history every week.